Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending where you are in the world, but either way, happy Tuesday. During today's presentation, you're going to have the chance to earn a couple of CEUs, and the way that you'll earn those CEUs is by staying the entire time of the webinar, and also by answering poll questions that are going to be popping up on your screen. So first, I wanted to, while everyone is starting to log in, I wanted to take the time and introduce Dr. Charles Catania, who's going to be presenting us today. A behavior analyst talks about sex and gender. So it's a little bit of a different kind of topic today. Hope you guys are all interested and ready for some discussion. In the questions box, not the chat box, but the questions box. I'm going to be fielding that box the entire time. So go ahead and throw your feedback, your thoughts, your questions for Dr. Catania, and I will be reading them all. We'll have some chance for Q&A throughout. But all right, so if you didn't have the chance to purchase the ability to earn CEUs yet today, or before the webinar, I should say, that's perfectly okay. You can use the link that I emailed out a couple of hours ago to purchase anytime you really want to. But if you want your CE certificate, first come, first serve, as soon as you kind of get up in the morning kind of thing, then I would recommend purchasing before lunchtime tomorrow, or before tomorrow morning, really. I will get back to my desk tomorrow and analyze all of the attendance and poll data. So please make sure you are also signed into either the GoToWebinar on your tablet or your computer, but you're just not dialed in audio only. If you're dialed in audio only, then GoToWebinar is not going to be able to recognize your attendance and kind of just basically let us know that you're here. We'll have no record of it whatsoever. So please, if you want a certificate of completion or CEUs or any kind of participation, please make sure that you are still logged in to the GoToWebinar app on the computer or tablet or phone, despite your technical difficulties using it or not. Just so it's logging your attendance, even if you got to hear it through your dial-in only. But alrighty, so I think that's kind of all I have to say for now. If you wanted a copy of the slides, they're under the handouts. You could download them there. But I'll go into a little bit more detail about polls and everything when the first one pops up. But for now, I think I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Catania.
Okay, greetings everyone. Let me just start by saying a word or two about these talks in general. As some of you know, some of you may have attended a couple of the earlier ones. These are monthly meetings in which we're covering a number of topics, many of which are not typically the topics included within the technical dimensions of behavior analysis. In the past, when I wanted to treat some new topic and I wasn't sure quite how to handle it, the way I do that would be to walk into the classroom and present that in a class for the first time, typically in the context of the courses I've taught in learning and in behavior analysis. And of course, for a faculty member walking into a classroom, it's kind of nice, at least during the time before COVID, when all of those were pretty much live, because the speaker gets some immediate feedback. You only need a few students in the class who look up occasionally or who nod as you say something. But you also can get immediate questions if you said something that isn't clear. For me, these talks have some of the same function. I've been trying to deal with some things that in behavior analysis we haven't talked about much. Some of you may have heard the earlier presentation on discrimination and prejudice. Discrimination is a term that we in behavior analysis have usually used in a technical way, but for most people, the rest of the population, this is a word which has very important social significance. And for us to neglect those possible extinctions, I think would be a problem. Some of the things we do in behavior analysis are relevant to a variety of different topics, and so today it's going to be my shot at trying to talk about what has become a more and more prominent, especially in contemporary American politics. So as you can see, I'm going to be talking about sex and gender. I'll say a little bit along the way about how different people sometimes distinguish between those two words. I feel that given the topic, it's probably not a bad idea to include in this a trigger warning. Perhaps some of you will find some of the content of this presentation disturbing or offensive. My hope is you will not. But for me, this is an exploratory presentation. This is the first time I'm trying out a presentation on this particular topic. And so that's one reason why, to me, the feedback, the questions you might ask are particularly important. I do want to know if occasionally I might say something that I would not seen as something people might be sensitive about, but turns out that it is. I want to get some feedback from you, and it's not just because you want to be sure that you folks are attending to what's going on, but also to get some sense about how this content works. Much of what I'll be talking about is derived from, has a very introductory treatment in my recent book, The ABCs of Behavior Analysis. And I'm putting this up in part to let you know that if there's a little bit there in the way of citations and just a couple of pages of material on this topic we'll be talking about today, but also, should you be interested in the book, you can get a 10% discount and free shipping if you go to the publisher who's willing to do that. So, and therefore, as this expression often is, without further ado, let's move on to the topic. And what I want to begin with is to talk a little bit about the spectrum. This is a picture of the electromagnetic spectrum going from gamma rays through X-rays and microwaves, radar and radio, long wave radio. And there's a little region in that spectrum in which energy is emitted, and it is what we call the visible spectrum. And this bottom graph expands it. It goes from the ultraviolet, which we humans don't see, but some other creatures we share the planet with do, on through all of the colors of the spectrum over to infrared. And when we look at the spectrum, we see it as a continuum. It does not have discrete lines drawn on it. There's a region in the yellow and there's a region in the orange, and there are regions in between. There is much orange as yellow. There are regions in between the blues and the greens as they merge into each other, and so forth and so on. You're presumably all familiar with this. Now, the trouble is we humans deal with things by talking about them. And we engage in verbal behavior. We talk, and verbal behavior consists of these discrete units we call words. And when we try applying these words to continua, like the color spectrum, we necessarily break these up into discrete regions. And so we take this visible spectrum, we blow it up, and suddenly we've got the greens, we've got the yellows, we've got the oranges, and typically we will go from calling something one word or another. There's a point at which we stop calling the particular wavelength red and we start calling it orange. Probably the cyan is familiar to us nowadays because it happens to be involved in the printer cartridges we get for our printers. In the days when before those cartridges around, it was usually red, orange, yellow, greens, blue, and violet. And the mnemonic for the spectrum used to be Roy G. Biv, a name, totally arbitrary name. But now cyan is in there, and it does have the advantage of breaking the spectrum up into fairly discrete parts. It doesn't mean there aren't huge differences in other languages, other cultures besides English. The places where the colors break down and the categories may differ from ours. There are also tremendous individual differences. For example, my mother was colorblind down in the blue-violet end of the spectrum. And that's very unusual. Women tend not to be, most color blindness is found in men. But my wife and I used to dispute whether I was also colorblind. And my mother would wear the darndest outfits. She couldn't tell violets from browns. And it was only after looking into this and discovering that I could, in fact, see all the stuff in the colorblindness test charts, so that there wasn't any behavioral evidence that I was colorblind. And it suddenly became obvious at some point that my problem was that I had learned the words for those regions from my mother. My father was, when I was a kid, he was out working a lot of the time, and obviously I spent more time with her, and that's where I learned the names of the colors of the spectrum, along with a lot of the rest of my vocabulary. Um, uh, so things change, people see different things, but the important point for our purposes is that we often break up continuous categories into discrete units, and that necessarily happens once words enter into the story. Um, Now, the color spectrum is important to us in a variety of ways, but we've extended that language to other dimensions. And for those of us in behavior analysis, it's probably the autism spectrum that's the most salient and the most familiar one to which we've extended things. And one of the things I'm going to do here is to try to extend these ways of thinking to these other dimensions that are dimensions involving us, and particularly the language of sex and gender. Some of you may have seen the gradual proliferation of the abbreviations, and I put one of the latest ones I found up here. This is the intersectional diversity of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, and the latest one, which I didn't even know about until just a few days ago, the Two-Spirit, which is Native American designation, communities. And sometimes people who are trying to put these kinds of things together add a plus on the assumption that all of this will grow and there'll be new categories coming up. Definitions are difficult, but I am going to make the case that these separate categories are dividing up a set of continua involving our human biology, our human behavior, our human physiology, in ways that obscure the continua that underlie these kinds of differences. So at this point, let's see whether you've been paying attention. We're going to have one of the first poll questions. The poll questions are one of the ways in which we find out whether you've been attending to what we've been saying. It gives me a little bit of feedback in this presentation. And also, as Marissa will be describing, they're also data that for those of you who are taking this, who are attending this mainly for continuing education credits, they are the kinds of feedback that is necessary for those credits to be delivered. So Marissa, over to you for poll question number 1.
Perfection. All right, everybody. So a blue screen with some multiple choice answers and a submit button should have popped up on your screen. And you should be able to select one and lock in your answer with that submit button. Please keep in mind that you will need to participate in these poll questions if you wish to earn CEUs today. If you don't, then you don't really need to worry about it, but your feedback is also very welcome. So this way we kind of know where everybody stands within understanding the content, as Dr. Catania was saying. Um, Now, if you didn't purchase the ability to earn these CEUs yet, that's okay. You can purchase them anytime, but I will be analyzing all of the data first thing tomorrow when I get back to my desk. So you should have your certificates by lunchtime if you wanted them. So I would suggest purchasing before then if you want like first come, first serve access when I send those instructions out tomorrow morning. If you need a certificate of completion but not a CEU certificate, that's going to come about an hour after we end here, and you don't really need to do anything but attend. You don't need to purchase anything, and you don't need to participate in anything except for the webinar and your attendance of the webinar. Um, so that's how that works. Yeah, for CEUs, would you need certification ID? Yeah, you would. They're BACB learning CEUs for today's webinar. So you would need to be certified there. If you need CEUs of any other kind, I believe you can use your certificate of completion depending on your certification, but I would check with your supervisor on that one. But alrighty, so I will shut this poll question down. And it like 5% say the visible, well, let's read the question first, which was not used as a spectrum example. The visible color spectrum says 5%, 22% say the autism spectrum, and 73% say the auditory sound spectrum.
Which is, of course, the correct answer, by the way. So glad it was most of you got that one. Okay, moving on. Well, what's happened with respect to these kinds of issues? The spectrum has been converted into a flag. Now, this is not quite the spectrum because the top part of this flag is pink, which isn't really, it's sort of a pink is a red diluted by white. But in any case, this was the first Pride flag, 1978. Harvey Milk asked Gilbert Baker to design it as I read that history. And so this is an illustration of the flag. It has evolved over time. And so the more contemporary one no longer has the pink region in it. But then there is another still more recent flag, a contemporary one, which has additional fields. And those are added to represent race and gender. And so we have the pride colors in the main field of the flag, and we have black, brown, and white, which I presume are supposed to, and by the way, I should mention, I've been only learning about all of these distinctions recently and reading about some of this history. So if I get any of this wrong, please correct me and forgive me my any mistakes I make with regards. I'm presuming also that the pink and blue represent straight genders. Now, even more interesting is that turns out that there's a whole array of different identifications. You have some of the dimensions that entered into that vocabulary, the LGBTQ, et cetera, vocabulary. But you also have a number of others in here: gender fluid, you have neutrals, androgynes, agender. So there are all of these varieties of flags, and all of these represent categories, most of which are distinctions based on behavior, but some of which are also distinctions based upon anatomy. And when you try to make sense of all of this, it becomes difficult because the dimensions of the differences are not clear. And certainly the dimensions of the differences are going to be different depending who you talk to. A conservative Republican who comes at this from biblical assumptions about sex and gender will come up with different kinds of categories that are regarded as legitimate than someone from a blue state and a different kind of orientation history with respect to these kinds of things. So let's get back to those initials then. It's an evolving acronym. It's changing all of the time. As those flags indicated, you have, and even within some of those identifications, the Q has sometimes been related to the word queer and also to the word questioning. And queer itself is a word that has a complex history. In the earlier days of those kinds of usages, it was derogatory term some of the time. And if you try to define it with respect to the others, or even relative to the others or on its own, it turns out that's very hard to do because these terms function differently in different groups of people. And as I mentioned already, there are these many other terms, the non-binary, pansexual, to describe gender, sexuality, physiological sex characteristics. These things are now coming up in the news, and they're evolving rapidly enough that it can be hard even to stay on top of the different ways in which the vocabulary works. So we're moving along fairly quickly in these kinds of things, but these are crucial kinds of antecedents before we move on to some other ways of talking about these things. So let's get right back into it. By the way, we're not going to interrupt quite as often later on, but let's get on to another poll question with respect to these recent couple of points that have been made.
Okay, everybody. So, major factor in the origins of discriminations along dimensions of sexuality is, go ahead and lock in your answer. And thank you so much for voting. Keep in mind that you do need to participate in these polls if you wish to earn your CEUs. However, if you get the answer incorrect, it won't count against you, but please do try to get it right as to the best of your capabilities, so this way we know and can gauge where to move on with the presentation, whether to repeat some information or whether to move on to the next topic kind of thing. But alrighty, I'll shut this down in about 3, 2, and 1. Thank you all for voting. Awesome. So it looks like, oh wow, 71% said words break up continua into discrete regions. 0% said B, trans conversions are ineffective. And 29% said they are imposed by legal systems.
I find that one interesting. We've been talking throughout this about how words break continua down. It is not necessarily false. I suspect legal systems, especially in some states, do tend to exacerbate some of the problems raised in discrimination along the dimensions of sexuality and so on. But for those of you answering subsequent poll questions, recall that this is not about the facts, but it's about what this presentation has said. And so that question was about what we had discussed in the presentation. So moving on, okay. Let's take this idea of a spectrum seriously as it might be applied to sex and gender. What are the possible dimensions? And this is something that all of you can think about independently, because there's no settled literature that I've been able to find in which there's any kind of consensus. But there are certainly some possibilities. Certainly anatomy is one of them. We know historically that that children are not all born either totally obviously male or totally obviously female, but in fact, and even in the classical times, there were intermediates recognized. A hermaphrodite was someone who's born with both male and female anatomy. So there are anatomical differences across individuals, and they can change continuously. There are changes in hormonal balance, the progesterone to testosterone and so forth. Those, the glands that produce those hormones can be more or less active and can produce differences. And of course, among the most complex of the dimensions, the brain and behavior. And perhaps also we need a dimension involving intensity. Somebody who is bisexual is somewhere in between the male and the female extremes, but so is somebody who's asexual. And yet the bisexual person and the asexual person are really different, and perhaps there's something there on a dimension involving the intensity of involvement with regard to sexual behavior. So all of these are the possibilities for us to consider. And in each of these, we might want to consider the words female and male as anchoring the extremes, but we might want to see where we could go with it if we start thinking about these kinds of things as continua, not as discrete categories, which we're forced into even by such simple things as the labels that we put on gendered restrooms. Those definitely dichotomize groups of people, and parts of the political turmoil in many states now, where legislation is being passed that dramatically impacts trans people, involves things like, well, which of those categories do you belong to? If it's a continuum, it makes it harder for those who would like to argue about what rights people have, that it can be justified to force people into one of these categories or another, especially if the boundaries are fuzzy ones. So let's take a look at this graphically. And now you got to be careful with this one, because like all of these things involving 3 dimensions, this at the bottom is the floor of this surface, okay? The point back here is in the distance. The point up here is, this line here is facing us. This is the back wall, and this is the left side wall. Now it may flip on you. They're optical. People who studied optical illusions think know that that kind of thing can happen. But let's try to keep this straight. And I've just arbitrarily picked out the places to put these dimensions. The anatomical dimension is the one that's probably most obvious. It's certainly the one that's that people can see, if except of course certain, depending on how people are dressed, but it's certainly visible properties most often, and they range from female to male. And as I mentioned, historically, we've known that there are anatomical continua. Um, Males differ in size, and we know that there are intermediate cases, sometimes referred to, and especially in the past, as hermaphrodites. But there are hormonal differences as well, and this is the depth of the thing, going from the front here to the back there, again, varying along a dimension in which female and male are the extremes. And finally, there is this third dimension, which is the height above this floor, which I've labeled neurobehavioral. And that's a complicated one. First of all, behavior is given certainly by some phylogenetic sources. Some of it is built in. We sometimes like to talk about that sort of behavior as instinctive, but also there's lots of behavior that's learned. And so this might be the dimension in which people could argue that some of these differences are acquired. Somebody behaves like a girl, somebody behaves like a boy, somebody dresses in certain ways, plays with certain kinds of toys, is interested in things. Whether we're talking about the biology and brain structure, or whether we're talking about behavior, it's so hard to separate these things that I've just combined them into a single dimension. But I can imagine somebody else coming along and wanting to have separate dimensions, one for the brain and neurology, and another for behavior and its history in the lifetime of a given individual. I also, for those of you who are thinking about this in terms of which topics get priority, I want to remind everyone that our subject matter is behavior analysis, and we tend to think about behavior as being the primary dimension. It's what we always look to first. Everything we do, our lives, are our behavior, and even with respect to evolution, behavior had to be primary. Organisms survived because of what they could do. So if you talk about an evolutionary history that brought us up through the early hominids and eventually to us humans, all of our ancestors in that long chain of ancestors that goes back and back and back and back throughout evolutionary history, all of them had to behave. They had to be able to find food. They had to be able to find water. They had to be able to find mates. They had to be able to escape from predators. And those were all things they could do. They had to do. And therefore, everything about their anatomies, their skeletal system, their muscles, their visual systems, and their nervous systems evolved in the service of what they could do. So in that sense, behavior always came first. And one of our strategies often is, as we deal with different kinds of problems, as have been doing and will be doing throughout this series, is to always look first to behavior and then see what it can do to illuminate the other kinds of issues we worry about. So there we have these sets of dimensions. I've offered only three. I've mentioned in passing the possible fourth one, which might be an intensity dimension. But let me assure you, it's really, really hard. It's hard enough to show a three-dimensional graph. It would have been really, really hard to show you a four-dimensional one. You'll have to settle for this. So placing some sexual identities within a space like this one could be straightforward. For example, if you're talking about bisexuals, you would presume that there's somewhere in between the male and the female, but where would that go? Would it be somewhere in the behavioral dimension? You might not expect to see that in the anatomical dimension, or maybe something about them is different in the hormonal dimensions. We don't really know. So there's a region in this three-dimensional space inside. These are the back walls of a cube that might belong to that group of individuals. But then the same can be said of asexuality, but where would it belong? Well, somewhere, again, in between some of these other dimensions. If you want to map it out, it would be not so much like breaking up the spectrum into different regions, each of which corresponds to a different color name, yellow, orange, red, and so on, but it would be actually carving out a space inside the three dimensions of that cube. I mentioned already the magnitude or in intensity, but it's hard enough to cope with cutting up the three-dimensional space. Trying to then produce a four-dimensional region within that four-dimensional space is something that we can't even graphically easily do. But maybe that's what we have to do in order to make sense of these dimensions. And as I look back, recall, we've got these various identifications of different groups of people, but where exactly does gay go? Is gay a thing that goes with, or a category that goes with people who identify themselves anatomically as males, but whose behavior in some ways is more similar to that of females? Then what do we do with a word like queer? How about lesbian? Is typically identified with people anatomically who would identify as female, but whose behavior with respect to other individuals is more like the behavior of males. But then again, the lesbian might argue, well, no, our behavior isn't at all like what male behavior would be like. So all of these questions get raised as soon as you start thinking in terms of continua. And it means that there's a lot to be resolved in how this vocabulary works. So let me now stop briefly we can go in quicker with this next one. Poll question number 3. I'm curious as to whether, Marissa, it seems to me that we had in some of those 4 alternatives, but only 3 are coming up. I hope that in none of these cases that are coming up will there be any ambiguities because of that. But let's see where you are with poll question 3.
Alrighty, here's poll question number 3. The continuum along asexual and bisexual individuals lies primarily anatomical, hormonal, or none of the above.
That's interesting because I thought that there was the neurobehavioral was another alternative.
This was what was inserted into the poll form, but
I'll
if
have to
you
look.
think it's something
How,
else,
no, this will work. This is fine. This is
okay,
fine.
okay, cool, sweet.
It
Then,
works.
all right, go ahead, everybody, proceed as normal. And I'll shut this down in about, I don't know, 3 seconds, two. And thank you for participating, everybody. Sweet. So it looks
Yeah,
like, I'm sorry?
no, go ahead.
Okay. So it's like
Okay, that was,
50% say anatomical, 34% say hormonal, and 51% say none of the above.
well, that was correct answer, but I'll just add that the way the topic as we finished up with was talking about the difference between bisexuals and asexual, both being between the male and female and differing on an intensive dimension. So, but that's telling me a good bit about. Remember, I'm trying these kinds of ways of talking about things with you folks. And an answer like this tells me something about how those are. Maybe I have to try to produce the four-dimensional figure, but thank you. Um, so moving on, there are still other complications. You know, we came up with talking about these three dimensions and the possible intensive ones, but there are other complications that complicate the way we can talk about these things. The dimensional attributes that may define an individual at birth might be interfered with, perhaps with surgery, perhaps with hormonal treatments, attempts at conversion, which we know are happening in some places. There are legal challenges to forced conversion for what some people argue are deviant kinds of sexual behavior. All sorts of ways in which uh, sexual behavior might develop and in ordinary environments uh, might be affected by political institutions, medical institutions, and so forth. Actually, one of the ways in which I got involved in and interested in these kinds of issues was when I encountered the book that I've illustrated here. This is Alice Drager's book called Galileo's Middle Finger. Notice it's been pixeled out in the middle in the cover picture. Apparently Galileo's middle finger is ensconced in some reliquary in some church in Italy somewhere, if one was interested in finding that. And I blundered on the book. It was simply on a shelf in a library where I was browsing once. But Heretics, Activists, and the Search for Justice in Science. The book came across as one about distortions of scientific findings and all, but once I started looking into it, it turned out that a good bit of it was about the history of the OBGYN field, mostly in the United States, but also elsewhere. And it turns out throughout a good part of the 20th century, if a child was born with ambiguous genitalia, the obstetrician will often simply try to fix the ambiguity surgically, and typically without even informing the parents, much less the child, who of course was a newborn and didn't have any say in what happened at all. Now consider what that means. It means that you have someone who would ordinarily have fit anatomically somewhere along that anatomical dimension from male to female. In other words, along this left to right dimension in the space that we've been talking about. But once the obstetrician has, quote, fixed that anatomical difference disappears. It's no longer visible, except that there might still be hormones being generated. The obstetrician is not going to go in and try to mess around with uh, the, the glands necessarily. Um, there are all kinds of mixes And those of you who may be skeptical about these kinds of things, it turns out that statistics show that the proportion of people who do have some kind of difference along those anatomical lines is fairly substantial, especially when you've got a population of millions. If you just have 1 or 2%, it's still a lot of people. And if then the OBGYN community over a long period of time has been interfering with that dimension, you have a mix in the population that becomes really difficult to know how to deal with because you don't know what would have been without that surgical interference. Other kinds of interference, as I mentioned, include hormonal treatments and so on, and behavioral treatments, forced inversions of people who the behavior of whom some people disapprove of. The book then is about Draeger's longstanding pursuit of the literature in this area, the various kinds of debates there have been. Some of these things have been fought out in medical journals. And so the literature is there. Those of you who are interested, I suggest you start there, or you start with Google and do your manuscript search. There's a wealth of material there. When I first encountered this, I found it revealing and a lot of it surprising because it was more extreme than I ever would have imagined. Now, of course, people do exaggerate things, and so you want to explore and look at the various kinds of literature that are out there. But it was thinking about these kinds of issues that eventually led me to try to develop a way of talking about it that eventually led me to try to draw up these sets of dimensions varying in anatomy, hormones, and these other dimensions. So there again, we're moving along kind of quickly on this, but we're ready for another poll question. Let's see what this one is like. Packed a lot into that little discussion of the Draeger book.
Alrighty, everybody. So, which is probably false about surgery on newborns born with ambiguous genitalia? I forgot how to read for a second. Sorry about that. Alright, everybody. Go ahead and lock in your answers. Just a quick reminder that if you didn't purchase CEUs already in the store, you can go ahead and do that. Give me a couple minutes and I'll throw the link directly in the chat box for you. And I will be going over all of this data first thing in the morning, and you will have your instructions to access your CE certificate by lunchtime. And if you only need a certificate of completion, that's going to be automatically emailed about an hour after we end here today. Okay, so I will shut this down in about 3. And thank you for voting. Okay, so it looks like 15% say that it has not been an unusual option. 33% have been rare without parental consent, and 52% say neither A or B.
Interesting, because in fact it has not been rare. And so it has been rare without parental consent is actually not true. And I probably should have emphasized that more in talking about Draeger's book, because one of the things is a very substantial section about the cases in which the OBGYN doctor would do the surgery and wouldn't even let the parents know that it had happened. And even and so sometimes, yes, parents have been asked, they've been told, look, this child is going to have a problem, do you want us to fix it? That sometimes has happened, but especially in the earlier parts of the 20th century, it was not at all rare. So my apologies for not having emphasized that more in my discussion of the Draeger book. I perhaps could have said more, and I find this feedback useful. So let's move on from that. So one of the things about this talk is that I've included the word sex and gender And that distinction is one of those others that's fraught with complications about definition. The latter word, gender, is historically more often been about grammar than it is about biology. So, for example, if you look at the European languages, you'll find that most of them have gender classes, either masculine and feminine or masculine, feminine, and neuter. And most of the time they're obligatory. You can't say certain, I think obligatory is misspelled there, my apologies. You can't say certain things without putting in the article. And once you put in the article, it is gendered, although it may be independently gendered with respect to sex. And the example that's the most obvious one is in German. If you're speaking of the girl, you say das Mädchen. But the article das, it's der is masculine, die is feminine, and das is neuter. So das Mädchen is actually using a neuter gender article, not a feminine one. But it would be feminine for the married woman, die Frau. I believe so also for die Fräulein, but who's the young woman, but or the woman, but the unmarried woman. But in any case, gender tends now to be often used interchangeably with sex in some, and then sex sometimes is used as an identifier for behavior. I'm going to just have to back off and try to not come up with any explicit definitions here, because I've seen variations in usage over time, and frankly, I'm still somewhat puzzled about how to proceed if one wanted to write about this and come up with some definitions, because it would be hard to come up with definitions that you wouldn't find some individuals objecting to. And certainly I'd welcome hearing from you folks about any of these definitional issues with respect to treating these kinds of things in the future. Well, but there's more to it than just those terms. There's also now the issue of the pronouns. And this is one source I have of trying to learn a bit about this. I must confess, I have a great deal of difficulty with respect to the pronouns. I've been finding myself reading articles, sometimes in the general news these days, and suddenly encountering the word they and realizing at some point that the word they is now the singular pronoun, referring to a transgender person who is now not using the pronouns he and she. And I must also confess my delinquency with respect to not having put my pronouns at the bottom of my email messages. It's partly a matter of finding it difficult to be comfortable in using the words. I have talked to colleagues who have found it really challenging and difficult to have a large class of students, and to find that there is some student you have to identify, and then you have to remember that with that particular student, you have to use a particular pronoun instead of the usual one. So there's a large burden being placed in some parts of the academic community on how to proceed, because of the problems of, on the one hand, trying to respect the individual's choices with respect to how you are called. Certainly if our names matter, so also the pronouns by which we are called should matter. And on the other hand, keeping track of it all and getting it right. The curious thing about the things that you find in this book on what's your pronoun is that a word like they was once not restricted to the plural case. If you go back to early English, the words from which they evolved were general in the sense that they could be used either for the individual, the single individual, or for the plural. And with all of these things, there are tremendous variations. So let's, pronouns, of course, are also components of verbal behavior. So I'm going to read through this and unpack a bit in what's in this passage. So we're talking about the way people talk about other individuals, and to the extent that the pronouns incorporate some of these issues of gender, and I think I've got gender right here because we're talking about their verbal and grammatical function. But if it's right to think about these as complex continua, which don't have very discrete boundaries, in which there's a blend of moving from one kind of population to another kind of population, and you gradually get from one to another. If that's the case, how much do you have to chop it up? How many different pieces do you need in there to make it work for all these subgroups? It's like trying to chop up that three-dimensional space, or the fourth dimensional extension of it, into particular regions, and then making boundaries. And instead of recognizing the continuities that exist in the world and in biology and in the dimensions that along which people vary, creating divisions, creating the kinds of things that lead to prejudicial ways in which some people treat other people. So with regard to sexuality, extending existing terms like they to these bounded categories, that might really be messed up because of their etymological histories. They come from these different places, but you can't easily coin new ones, because then you've got different groups in different places coming up with new ones, and it's really, really hard to get people to accept these new ones. Not only they're not just they're unfamiliar, but they conflict with the similar but incompatible existing terms. It's trying to get people to change the way they talk about other people. I have a history with respect to that in a much simpler dimension. When I was the editor early on of the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior, I had a history of having learned about using the term reinforcement in my undergraduate career with Nat Schoenfeld and Fred Keller. And in their book, which was right from the introductory course, they always, or almost always, almost exclusively talked about reinforcing the responses. You reinforce the rat's lever press, you reinforce the pigeon's keep back, you reinforce the child's good behavior. Skinner was a lot more flexible in his uses. Let's put it this way. I could say disorganized in his uses, but let's say he was a lot more flexible in his usage. He would sometimes write about reinforcing the rat, or reinforcing the pigeon, or reinforcing the child, and he'd sometimes talk about reinforcing the rat's lever press, or reinforcing the pigeon's keep pack, or reinforcing the child's good behavior. So I had these two histories, and fortunately, when I was a graduate student, and later when I was a postdoc, I often got into debates with people about this usage. And we came to the conclusion that the advantage of talking about reinforcing the responses was that you always had to say what the reinforcer depended upon. What was this organism doing when this particular consequence followed? If the grammar made you say it, then you were less likely to say something that was ambiguous, that somebody else wouldn't understand. You left out the response that produced this consequence, and therefore you left out the thing that was supposed to be changed by it. You left out what the reinforcer was supposed to be acting upon. Well, being a journal editor gives you a very special kind of power. The contingency there is that the journal will not have a paper in it unless this particular individual, who's the editor, and that time that was me, sends it on to the printer. Nobody else can do that. And so we ended up talking about it, and of course it was not a decision I made totally on my own. And we came up with the policy that when people were writing about things, unless they had a rationale for doing otherwise and could justify it, that everybody should talk about reinforcing responses and not reinforcing organisms. Well, we started that up, and some years later, Skinner submitted a paper, and in it, by that time I was no longer editor, but a colleague of mine, some of you may know him, Victor Ladies, was editor, um, sent me a note saying, look, Charlie, Skinner has been writing about reinforcing the rat. What are we going to do about it? If Skinner can say that, how can we ask anybody else to follow our stylistic guidelines? And I wrote back to say, to give this little argument and to suggest some alternatives. And instead of then taking my argument and writing back to Skinner, all Vic did was to send my letter on to Skinner. But his response was fine. He accepted the change. It was just a couple of sentences in a paper of his, which got published with the changed sentences. And we then met him later at a professional meeting. And we asked him what he thought about that. And he said, well, you've got to keep up with the times, which is fine for us. Nevertheless, subsequently throughout his career, we would often find him writing new stuff in which he talked about reinforcing the organism, not reinforcing the response. Now, if we had that kind of thing within a professional audience about a professional subject matter, imagine how tough it is to change the histories and the kind of speech with respect to these kinds of issues in the country as a whole, especially when you have dueling political views and the sorts of turmoil over how you deal with things like transsexual children and adults and people trying to pass laws to regulate their behavior. This hardly seems like a democratic thing espoused by a culture that talks about freedom. But they are the kinds of things we're dealing with. It is my guess, and I could be wrong, that many of these distinctions will not be maintained over time because there will be too many of them, because the boundaries will always remain ambiguous, and that we've got to find some better ways of talking about these things. Now, I don't think it's necessarily going to be anything like this set of dimensions that I've suggested here, but I suspect it has to be something that moves to a way of talking that respects the continua and remarkable variability of human sexuality, which involves anatomies and brains and behavior and hormones and maybe dimensions we haven't even considered yet. So this is more of an introduction to the problem and an attempt to share the questions. I don't know exactly where we go from here, but maybe this is a little bit of a start. And with that much, let me get at least one more poll question in. And
Alright.
Marissa,
Yeah.
this one, I guess, down to 3 as well. I don't know why that happened, but let's see. Okay.
Yep. So, all right, everybody, here's the next poll question. A problem with gender pronouns is that, and go ahead and lock in your answer. And I'll shut this one down in about 3 seconds because everyone's just about voted that it looks like should be.
Oh, we had an easy one.
Yeah. Alrighty. And it is looking like it's in a pretty good direction. I'm gonna shut this down in 3, 2, and all right. Here are the results.
Okay, 89%. Thank you, folks. I appreciate that. By the way, the fourth alternative I thought was going to be in there was neither A nor B, but it sounds like hardly anyone would have chosen that one anyway. So that's good. Well, by the way, yeah, let me just move on a little bit. I just have a little bit more in the way the formal parts of the presentation, so, well, yeah, so then I do need feedback, and now is the time for discussion, but there's one more. And Marissa, what I don't know is if the fourth alternative in this one, if one of the alternatives is missing. Originally, this was a question about you folks in the audience, and the alternatives were uh, well, let's see. I don't remember exactly, but one of the alternatives was supposed to be I do not choose to answer. So this is a question about your own sexual orientation or identification. It is not anything in which we will keep anybody's individual data. It's mainly to get a sense of what the audience is like. But you may choose not to answer this if you wish. So there's no obligation to answer this one, but it's for, again, for our information. So let's do that one now and get it out of the way, and then we can open things up for questions and discussion.
Alrighty, everybody, here is that last poll question.
Okay. The first alternative that's, well, let's see, yeah. Oh, I guess there was an other alternative. The fourth alternative was other, but I guess maybe given that the spectrum can include just about anything, maybe that other category doesn't matter anyway, so it's fine to just do it as this is.
Okay, and I will shut this down in just a minute, and just keep in mind that you do not need to participate in this, or you could choose, I prefer not to say, to lock that in for CEUs and everything. This will not count against you if you choose not to participate in this question.
It won't be saved or won't be used in any way, and certainly not in connection with anybody's identification.
And I will shut this down. Okay, everybody, here's just the quick results for Dr. Catania's review. And I'll shut them down quickly.
Okay. So that was 22% on the spectrum. That okay, thank you. So, Marissa, do we have some questions and comments?
Yes, there is for a lot of feedback. Well, quite a couple feedback in the chat box. Let's see. So it says, oh, this one came in rather early, so not to jump ahead, but I am finding concerns with my clients who are finding themselves worried when they wear something or have something that is rainbow. It's becoming a symbolic. It's becoming symbolic for the LGBTQA plus community. How can we assist with our clients who already have social troubles with these topics?
Well, gee, if I'm not a clinician, first of all, and I suspect that the kinds of troubles different individuals have involves all sorts of variations. Depends upon family settings. I would suspect somebody who has who's in a family in which they're affirming person's identity is going to have very different kinds of issues than someone in a family that tends to, that might even go so far as to shun someone. Um, uh, the, there are different religious groups have different views with respect to homosexuality and others of these kinds of dimensions. So I don't think there's any one answer fits all. One of the things I think that's most important is that there are people who might say, well, I would like to support the folks in this other group, but maybe if I wear this kind of thing expressing solidarity with them, people are going to assume I'm gay too, and I don't want to concede that. And so one of the things that I think has to happen is that people have to recognize that these identifications are identifications of support, and in itself, the rainbow flag, after all, it represents the different groups. And the most general one, let me get back to that. The most recent versions include all the groups. So by wearing or displaying a flag like this, it doesn't mean that you're saying I'm trans or I'm gay or I'm lesbian or I'm this or I'm that or the other. It means I support all of these different kinds of people, and I can do that without even you worrying about who I am. Now, some people are identified in groups, and that's inevitable. If you're Black, you will presumably have some physical characteristics. But in demonstrations over Black Lives Matter and those kinds of things, you can watch the news and can find that very often you'll find a lot of folks of other racial identifications joining the crowd, and that is in support of the groups. I don't know that there's any way to generally make that a generally accepted way in which people think about giving support. But some of the reasons some people don't provide support is they're worried about whether they will somehow be identified, and they're not quite comfortable enough to allow their identification. I come from a time when somebody who was gay or would probably not talk about it. Coming out came a bit later as an identification. There are people who were friends of mine who most other friends of them sort of figured they were probably gay, but never actually got around to talking about it. I think that's an unfortunate kind of a history, but it's the way things were. It is at least the case, and coming out is really a marvelous metaphorical term, because it now means that you don't have to keep things secret. I don't know if this is helpful with respect to your question, because it's such a varied kind of set of circumstances. Each person who is dealing with those kinds of things about personal identification is dealing with different problems within the family, within the social and political culture of the part of the country in which they're living at the time, and the way in which one copes in all of those different situations, it seems to me, is going to be different. People might select the places in which they live, in which they will be able to manage best. But if that happens, then you end up with segregations, all varieties of segregation. So we're just scratching the surface, and right now that's the best I can do. I wouldn't mind if you have a follow-up. I'd love to have it from you.
Righty. Here's another one. I'm interested to hear Dr. Catania provide definitions for sexuality and gender, respectively.
I hope that question was asked before I later said that it would be very hard for me to do that. Certainly that there are biological definitions. One could come up with definitions with respect to the human population, with respect to the X and the Y chromosomes and that sort of thing. And one could start detailing things about the anatomy. There are all kinds of strange things that happen. For example, there are documented cases of women who appear in terms of anatomy to be women at the female end of the spectrum, and yet it turns out that anatomically some surgery might discover that they also happen to have undescended testicles. Now, what do you do with a case like that? How would you define that person? I would say that person would still want to be identified as a woman, particularly if the woman, in terms of behavior, is involved with other humans as a woman. So we have to recognize that the words are always disturbing things, or are making our lives complicated, and that's true. I mean, after all, the color spectrum is like that. There is no physical reason for calling this region of the spectrum with certain boundaries, this region red, and then to cut it off and at some point start talking about this other region as orange. It's part of our social and cultural practices. And similarly, coming up with definitions is kind of nice, but the definitions have to depend upon the usages. It's not much help to come up with a definition and find that most people won't even agree to it. There again, I've had substantial experience with respect to that, with respect to the vocabulary behavior analysis, because I've in the course of trying to teach about our discipline, I've written some glossaries in which I've provided definitions of reinforcement and there are some of them that are really tough to deal with, like the word stimulus. The word behavior itself is a tricky kind of word. You know, historically, it came from things like you have to behave yourself, which is a behavior implied good behavior. You can misbehave, and our word behavior is of a different sort. And if we start looking at other languages, we can see how strange it is with respect to English, because you've got words like comportement that's the word that gets translated as behavior in French, comportamento in Italian. There's aprendizaje. No, I'm sorry, that's learning. If you go around with different languages, there are some that really don't map into things like the English language words, and so translation becomes difficult too. So I do think that gender does have an element of verbal usage in it. Um, uh, it's and I haven't looked at this systematically, but I suspect that having talked about these kinds of things, when you folks are reading the newspaper and you read articles about zoo animals and birds that solve problems or use tools, or pets that press buttons and so on, you might pay attention to whether they talk about the animals in terms of males and females or genders. I think you'll find that mostly they are words involving sex and male and female terms, and they are more likely to talk about gender and things that at some point bringing questions of usage and vocabulary. What I did learn in the course of doing all these glossaries are that that the usages are variable, and some definitions that I would write for some things would be found objectionable by other behavior analysts even. Um, the toughest part of it all is you can't. It's very difficult to coin new words and to get them accepted. It happens from time to time. Yeah, when you come up with new procedures and you're doing experimental work, and you have, as in the early days of schedules reinforcement, a fairly limited population of people doing these kinds of things, then if you come up with a new procedure and you give it a name, the chances that it'll be picked up on are pretty good, because you don't have to influence a lot of other people to use it. It's something new, they need some way of talking about it, and it gets picked up not because it's an existing word, but because it's or it's applied to something that's already got a name for itself. But it's a new thing and you need something for it, and there's nothing else that's competing with it, and that makes the odds pretty good. With respect to these issues that we've been talking about, one of the things that we're up against is that we've got an existing language that's developing in different ways all around the country in different local environments, and to move that's a really difficult. Um, I almost said that's a huge problem, and I just suddenly stopped myself because I suddenly find that saying the word huge is a bit more aversive than it used to be in earlier days, but never mind. Um, so I've probably gone on too long on that, but I think the gist of it is I just can't do that for you. I can't really define sex or gender, and I leave the definition of sex to the biologists. And let's leave the definition of gender to the linguists. How about that? So did we get a follow-up question, by the way, from the person who asked the first one? Because I did invite that person to follow up. Um,
Follow up. Oh, I believe so. Um, I hear what you were saying in regard to this question. It does get complex in these circumstances with environment, biological, and relationship variables when we bring it back to behavior analysis. With that said, in respect, with these various pronouns and spectrums, are we not already dividing like we see without visible spectrum? We have violet, purple, lilac, etc. Where is the boundaries with translations, symbolic, and support?
hmm. Well, those are all good questions. Yeah, what I have been saying is that we do, just as soon as we start naming the categories, we're doing that kind of division. We're breaking it down, and that we have to be careful that when we do so, we respect the underlying continuities, and we recognize that something can move from one place to another. After all, as the sun sets, the sensitivity of different regions of our eyes change, and the colors that we named as one color during the bright sunlight that we might call by a different name because the actual spectrum changes as time goes. People change from one environment to another. Um, uh, so, um, and in the days when sexual identity often included some secret dimensions and people were less likely to come out, um, these were people who behaved one way in some social settings and a different way in other social settings. And which one is, do you want to say which one is the real one? Well, they're both real. They're both people whose behavior is maintained by interactions with others. And those interactions are what are the most important parts of all of these kinds of things. Uh, I think that the kinds of things that are most difficult with respect to the political problems that are going on now is that the disrespect and the mistreatment that goes just as after a long history of slavery in this country, if you're a member of the Black population, um, you still have to deal with the remnants of that history and the ways in which in some parts of the country, some of the ways of dealing with others still persist. Well, yeah, we've also got a long history with respect to sexual. After all, women's suffrage is a fairly recent thing within the last century that it happened. Um, Laws with respect to property and all, with respect to men and women change. So we got all of uh, the gender um, um, or sex discriminations that have gone on for time, and we're gradually dealing with some of that. What the issues with respect to the LGBTQ communities are is that this is now another dimension which is being added to the ones in which people are beginning to recognize that there are differential kinds of treatment here and that some people's bodies have been disrespected, especially if you're talking about the cases in which the uh, OBGYN medical community at some points in the past has surgically intervened to do that. Um, so, so all of these are political fights. In these political fights, people can learn from the ways in which other groups have gradually produced change over time in the civil rights movement, in the suffragist movements, and so forth. These are similar kinds of things going on, and they inevitably come up with labels because people who are involved in a movement have to call themselves by some kind of name, whether it's political party names. These are really difficult problems, and I feel what I'm maybe doing here is getting people aware of the problems more. Coming up with solutions is really hard. Um, we have to do the best we can, but I think we are making some progress. We at least have in behavior analysis and in the people who look to behavior analysis, we have a small population of people who are now looking for solutions and who are doing things. What we have to hope is that we've got these little entries here and there in the culture in which the things that we do are gradually getting out there and making a difference. So I hope we can do it before we get overwhelmed by things like climate change and other kinds of things that will make life even more complicated and difficult. So on that cheery note, do we have more questions that you think, Marissa, have you picked out any that you think are particularly worth following up on?
We do have
We
a,
have about 20 minutes, by the way, um, if I'm reading my timing right. So we
mhm,
have time.
yep. So let's see. Can Dr. Catania speak to the changes in behavior analysis field from the times of applying punishment to perceived gay behaviors? For
Oh,
example, Reckers and Lovas, wrong behaviors in play are systematically punished using anything from planned ignoring to spanking, while, quote, right behaviors in play are reinforced.
yeah, I hope that that stuff is pretty much obsolete. I was surprised sometime recently in which I met some people, including a next door neighbor, by the way, involved in special ed. Um, and hearing about that in the special ed community, some parents referred to as ABA PTSD parents. And these were people who had a young child at the time when Ivar Lovas was doing his, uh, what he called applied behavioral with the AL at the end analysis, and did use punishers and lots of aversive stuff. And those kids are now adults, and those parents did have a difficult time. And the special ed folks were right if they found that there were after effects of those kinds of procedures that were problematic. But I think we have generally moved far, far away from that. In fact, we now have ethical guidelines which talk about always seeking the least restrictive ways of changing behavior. Um, uh, and and it's not only a matter of ethics and so forth. There are really practical reasons not to use aversive stuff. Um, there's good reason for us to stick to the reinforcers. If you use aversive things like punishment, um, and or taking away reinforcers, um, there are side effects of doing that. Um, it's aversive not to give a child something when the child has gotten into the past. And if the kid throws a tantrum when you don't provide the reinforcer, then you ought to learn that what you should do is come up with reinforcer early before anything like that happens, and then use it constructively to shape something better. But that's a skill. It takes somebody with a lot of experience in behavior analysis to use it well. Oh, I should be more careful in that. I mean, some parents have come through ways of doing things with their children, which that's the way they generally have come to do things anyway, and they don't need to learn it from us. Um, we know that using aversives like shock or spankings or whatever, oh, and by the way, in some states in the Midwest, uh, paddling kids is still legal in school. Kids can be swatted or spanked by the teacher, and that's okay. Well, what happens there is certainly the teacher becomes aversive. And what teacher is going to be more effective if the one thing you've done is made the kid not want to come and see you or get away from you as soon as possible? Um, and then they wonder that the kids might not want to come to school after all. So we have a whole set of good behavioral reasons, and I won't go into the technical details of it. We got a whole bunch of basic research that argues that changing behavior using reinforcers, strengthening behavior that way, is much more effective and runs into fewer problems than trying to change behavior by using aversive stuff to get rid of the stuff you don't want. And after all, if you want the child to say this when the child sees that, like saying the letter A when you see the letter A written on a board, um, then why not reinforce that directly? You'd have a hell of a time getting there by trying to punish everything else but, because you've got an infinite number of other things you've got to get rid of if that's going to be what's left and what emerges. It's actually, it's also more practical, it's more useful, it's more effective. So it's nice when you have the ethical reasons and the social reasons and the humane reasons all working consistently with the practical reasons that derive from our discipline. Um, they all have argued we're going to go with the good and stay away from the bad. And it's not, and it's also probably better for the way other people see us. I would hope that the kids who come out of programs now, the children who go to a place like Verbal Beginnings, and where the parents bring a child whose behavior is located on the autism spectrum, and they find that that child comes away having learned a whole bunch of things that the parents weren't up to teaching on their own. Will come away from it and talk well about us and have positive things to say about us as well. It all fits together. I hope that addresses the kinds of concerns you have. I think we go for the reinforcement. Positive reinforcement's a good thing, and look at how terrible the world is when other people try to get other people to do things using aversive stuff. The most visible, disastrous example of that is war. And we still see too much of it around in the world today. And that's another big worry, but that's, again, another different story. But notice that all of that stuff involves people trying to use aversive methods to get other people to do things. Do you have a cheery question, Marissa?
Alrighty, a cheery question. Let's see. Does Mr. Catania have any recommendations for literature and studies on autism and gender dysphoria?
Oh my, no. I can say that right off. Look, that is not an area in which I've specialized much. I'm sure there's plenty out there. My guess is that some of the other people who are in the audience here today would be better resources for that than I would be. And also some other presenters who are specifically talking about the autism spectrum. I've yeah, I think I have to leave it at that. There are special interest groups in ABBA who I presume have listservs. You might go to one of those and ask if you're looking for beginner stuff. I'm sure people would have introductory stuff. If you're looking for more technical things, then I think you want to look to the folks who are actually doing that sort of work. I mean, I'm somewhat familiar with it. I've been at some of these places and watch procedures, but it's not something I've ever worked with myself. So it would be inappropriate for me to try to do that simply because I don't have that kind of background. Sorry.
Alrighty, let's see. Read another one. All right, so when there is clearly nothing informal about having a certain gender or sexual identity, how can behavior analysts leave their individual political or religious perspectives out of their practice when those are pervasive to how we live our daily lives,
Okay,
even
I
without
missed.
punishment? I'm sorry?
Could you read the beginning part of that again? I missed the first. I didn't quite understand the first something in the first few words.
So when there is
Could,
clearly nothing immoral with having
oh,
a certain gender or sexual identity, how can behavior analysts leave their individual political or religious perspectives out of their practice when those are so pervasive to how we live our daily lives? Even without punishment, I could see a practitioner even unconsciously reinforcing heteronormative behaviors.
yeah, that's a really powerful question, and I appreciate your asking it. Uh, it that mean one of the things that I think it's really important for us to do is to bring out things so that instead of it being implicit bias. People call that implicit bias, and so on. You have to have it pointed out to start recognizing that you're doing it yourself. And I wouldn't be surprised if I've said things along the way here that show certain kinds of biases I have. Just I was looking at the dimension here, and the right side is usually the dimension where an important variable is, and I got the male here and the female over on the left side. But then again, um, uh, and the male is on the top here on this dimension, but the female is in the higher dimension here. So there could be biases just in where you place the male and the female in a graph like this. And I didn't even think about that until after it was done, and it was enough to get this done that I haven't changed it. But so the first of all is to start to just asking the question, what are my own biases? We all have complex verbal histories, and for those of you who may have missed it, one of the distinction I made in the last talk we had about a month ago was to distinguish between discrimination as a word that is based on actual interactions and contingencies which lead you to respond some ways to some kinds of things in the world, and in other ways to other kinds of things in the world. So we respond to things like male and female physical attributes. And most of us will most of the time be able to say, yes, that's a man, that's a woman. We make those discriminations, and we make it on the basis of a long history of interacting with other people. But some of what we do is a little different from that. And I've tried to make the point that the word prejudice is different from the word discriminate. We discriminate among people. We also have our prejudices with respect to people. But prejudice typically originates on the basis of things we've heard. It's prejudgment. We were told things about people, and probably lots of the things that we believe about other groups, other identifications, some of that comes from things we're told, things that the social communities have examples that were given, and not by actual interactions with other people. But the interactions with other people are what's primary, and that's where our starting place ought to be. So once you start looking at things this way, then you've already made the first step in just asking that question, because then you've got to identify the kinds of sources. When you're talking about religious groups, for example, you'll find that there are religious texts that already have things to say about groups that are not identified with the main male-female polarity and identification. And if you look at Muslim practices, you look at Judaic practices, you look at Christian practices, you look at the practices in various Asian religions, Shinto in Japan, and Confucianism and so forth. All of these involve various kinds of identifications, and they're different in different religious groups. And just by looking at those groups, once you recognize that there could be a problem, you may be identifying some of the things that you're predisposed to worry about. And depending upon what your own origins and what your own upbringing were like, you might find some more difficult to deal with than others. Once you've identified it, then that could make a difference. But we've got to go. It's interesting that the first part of your question was about the morality of it, and morality generally does come from religious prescriptions, religious statements about what's good and what's bad. And so religions are sometimes part of the problem. It seems to me that some of the issues involving transgender people these days comes from Christian fundamentalism. I'd find it hard to imagine that not being the case, given the laws that are being passed in some of the red states. Um, so the how to deal with it once you find it, that's a little trickier because that's going to depend on the details. That's going to be idiosyncratic with respect to different people and their biases. But I think what you've put your finger on is the importance of first recognizing that it's there. Um, and then the things that the people who are involved in demonstrations and so forth is to raise, they talk about raising awareness. And the trouble is that sometimes political demonstrations can lead to problems because even though you've getting people to recognize that there's a difference, you're not doing it in a way that is opening up conversation and then bringing things to change. But it's hard to know what the right answers are to these things when you have such complex political things. My own worries about this have focused on the issues of the shaping of verbal behavior. I think some of you know some of my research has been about shaping what people say, like getting a child pressing a button, and if the child is just indifferently pressing this button at a certain pace and that other button at a certain pace, but the buttons are different and that they involve different contingencies of payoff. And if you get the child to say, if you can use differential attention to what the child is saying to get the child to say, uh, the way this one works is if you press it a lot without stopping, and the way this one works is you have to press and rate. When you get the child to say that, you get the child to do that also. The child's behavior changes once you get what the child says to change. Now, I think that a lot of what goes on in politics and religion involves the same kinds of things. The charismatic leader gets the audience to say certain kinds of things, and the audience then does it. Um, um, I invite you to think about Trump's speech on January 6th. I invite you to think about the kinds of things that um, totalitarian leaders do, like speeches by Hitler or these days speeches by Putin. Uh, they not only say things, but they get their audiences to say things in response, and they can do it even when the speaker is not always paying attention to them, because then the other members of that audience reinforce each other's behavior. And once you get them to say things, that's what they do. So when you're involved in these kinds of things and asking those kinds of questions about your own behavior and the behavior of colleagues, you can ask about the way the world is and whether what they're saying makes sense and all of that, but you also have to ask questions about, are they saying it just because a lot of people have responded to them, have reinforced what they've been saying, and has my own behavior been shaped up because of the ways in which some people have approved of it, other people haven't? Once we're looking at our own behavior that way, we start making different judgments about it, and maybe even that could change our judgments about what's moral and what's immoral. Um, Again, we're just scratching the surface on these kinds of issues, but mainly we would hope that as we learn to do it with respect to our own behavior, it seeps out there into the broader community. Again, I come to this point and I know a lot of this is unsatisfactory, but at least I think it moves us in the right directions. So many thanks for that question. I think is a really important one. Do we have
Oh,
time for Marissa,
um,
or
well, there's
can
just
we?
about a minute left, so it doesn't really seem like we have any time unless you guys want to stay after.
Yeah, do you have any questions in the pool you've got that's different enough from the kinds of things that we've already covered that you think is worth getting out there? Maybe take it.
Um, there is maybe one more
Oh,
that I would maybe say we could ask and then call it quits, but I'll say my closing. So this way, because it's about to be 3:10 and we were scheduled to end then, just in case anybody had made like some certain arrangements around that, you have met your CEU hours, so you are free to go if you wanted to. If you wanted to purchase your CEUs in the store, go ahead for it. I'll analyze all that data first thing tomorrow and send you an email with instructions to get your certificates tomorrow. If you need a certificate of completion, that's going to come in about an hour. It's going to say my name, and it's going to come from a GoToWebinar email address with the subject line, "Thank you for attending," and a bright blue button will be in there for your certificate of completion. But all right, let's get back to this last question before we wrap up. So how can we reconcile or commence discussions of cultural expectations with the conversations of gender and sexuality? With the increase of immigrations, there are words used in certain cultures which are perceived as aversive to the LGBTQ community. These are words these words are usually innocent, but immigrants are seen as homophobic.
Hmm. Yeah, well, again, there's a question asking about a solution, and I think recognizing the problem is the first part of it. Immigrants have a whole series of challenges if they're learning a new language. Yeah, there are signs that are perfectly innocuous in the United States. Hand signs, I mean, certain gestures we make that would be regarded as obscene if you made them in Brazil, for example. I know of a couple like that because, uh, and I mean, even British English and American English differ enough. There used to be some expressions uh, that would cause embarrassment in one country but not the other, and people simply have to learn those sorts of things. Um, for me, the problem is that one must be, even if one feels offended by something, one must be tolerant as well. The If you know that people are immigrants and that English is their second language and they're learning about our culture and they say something that troubles you, I think it behooves you to say, "Excuse me, but you know, in this country, among the people we took, that is what you just said. Some people are offended by, and maybe you could say it this way." Offering help is an alternative to now. This, by the way, goes back to the first topic in my first talk was about political correctness. And what's involved in political correctness is people shut down other people for saying things that they regard as offensive. Um, at that time, I told the story of, which was sort of apocryphal, of a senior faculty member who was asked to give a talk about the history of the field and who started by saying, well, when I was a faculty member and we had women who were applying for our graduate program, we used to talk about them and ask whether uh, it was worthwhile admitting them to the program, even if they had great credentials, because uh, we knew that some of them might just get their degrees, but then get married and have babies. And at that point, that particular speaker was just shut down. The lights were turned off, and the speaker went dead. And that was cancel culture. That was because talking about women that way was offensive to some of the ones who were in control of the thing. Okay, again, the details of that story, there were a couple of incidents, but they differ in detail from the one that I've just mentioned. This faculty member, according to this apocryphal story, would have gone on to say, but we admitted them anyway. And yes, they did get married and had children, but nevertheless, they really worked hard and they all became leaders in the field. So turning what seemed to be an offensive statement around, what this particular person would have been doing was actually praising people and kidding the ones who would have been making the mistake of using the gender or the sex as a criterion. I think in our field that clearly has changed a lot. We have many women in really important and responsible positions in the field, and uh, but shutting things down is just closing off the dialogue. And so therefore we have to be tolerant of the differences, tolerant of different kinds of histories, and figure that our job is to teach the stuff, to teach it in a way that's effective, that we can change the behavior of others, get them to see the things so that there is mutual respect. It has to work both ways. We have to listen to what other people have to say, even if it sometimes makes us uncomfortable. And but you know, diversity is the engine of variability. Variability is what gives us the variations from which new ideas come, from which new ways of doing things come. It's an incredibly important part of our culture. And to me, the simple criterion with respect to, you might want to talk about this as morality versus immorality. The immoral things to do are to close down the variations, to limit people, to restrict options. And that seems to me the program that we find in contemporary politics on the Republican side. Uh, the laws that get passed are typically restrictive laws, limiting options. And if variability is the source upon which uh, uh, and diversity is the source for the variability upon which evolution depends, then we have a good reason to urge openness to others, um, avoiding aversive things, and political correctness and cancel culture are aversive control procedures. If we're going to avoid punishment in other arenas, we got to avoid it there in our interactions with our colleagues as well. So I hope that that is a direct enough answer to your question.
Alrighty,
So, okay, well, I want to thank everybody. I especially appreciate the comments and your attention to these issues. I appreciate your tolerance of my ignorance with respect to some dimensions of this, but I hope this is a beginning of at least bringing these topics into a place where we behavior analysts can think about them. And it's not as if nobody else has ever talked about them, of course, but that some of these ways of thinking about continua will turn out to be useful over the long run. Thank you very much.
all right, everybody. Have a great day, and go ahead and sign up for our June session. It is available in the store now. You can sign up for free. But we will see you then. Bye.
Bye bye.